So we talked about Thailand and Indonesia. So John, maybe you can tell us a little about the insight into China.
Why is the guy from the United States talking to you about China? So, it's something we've been looking at the Al Mann Foundation for a while. I'm going to give a little different kind of talk today. At the suggestion, almost the insistence of Lakshmi, there is not a single pie chart, bar graph, trend line, and also very few words actually in my talk today other than the ones that I'll be telling you about. And it drills in deeply to a very specific problem. I'm going to put that right there because I think it's going to spill off on me if I leave it where it is. And it begins here. We have a saying in the United States that everything is bigger in Texas. That has given rise to a whole lot of, what I'm telling you is I'm going to tell you a story to finish the point in pictures and numbers, very few numbers. This everything's bigger in Texas has spawned all manner of whimsical examples like these 50-foot tall cowboy boots outside a shopping mall in Texas. But what I'm here to talk about is something that's even bigger, China. It's caught our attention recently because there's a public health care crisis that is looming and has been looming for a few decades now. And I think it presents both opportunities and obligations to the communities that are represented in this room, the healthcare communities in both the public and the private sectors. What makes China such an intriguing, compelling, rich place to do business in pharma and medical devices is driven by one principal number: 1.4 billion people. The sheer size of the markets, combined with the limited penetration of sophisticated devices and medications, provide fertile ground for impressive growth. Whatever disease or condition might exist in the United States or Western Europe, it's going to be 4 to 5 times larger in China. China has a growing and increasingly affluent middle class, a population that will shortly exceed the size of the total population of either the United States or Europe, and in due time will actually exceed the population of both of them combined. And it's a population that is becoming increasingly concerned about health issues, both for themselves and for their aging parents and grandparents. Growing and modernizing the healthcare sector in China is no longer a nicety or a luxury. And what drives the urgency of this problem has been developing for the past 4 decades. That problem is China's aging population. Now, the best way to understand this problem visually is through what's known as a pyramid graph. I'm sure you've seen them all the time, but I'm not using a graph. That's a cake in front of you. Because pyramid graphs look a lot like layer cakes. It's a way of organizing data in a hierarchical way, where the layers get smaller from the bottom as you go up. They don't all look like layer cakes, though. Oh, and this is what, so this would be if you're building the layer cake by age, you just assign different ages to different groups, and the size gets smaller as you go up, hopefully. They don't all look like layer cakes, though. Some of them look like beehives. If you look at the graph for the world as a whole, it looks something like this, where the sides are sloping out in a very slight sort of way. It's not a bad, it's an expanding population on average, but only a slightly expanding one. Ironically, the only thing that you don't want your pyramid graph to look like is a pyramid. This is where China found itself in the middle of the last century, and determined that it had to take action to reverse what it saw as an unsustainable trend. And this led to the next significant number that I want to talk about in China. And that's the number 1, as in one-child policy. It was implemented in 1979, and by some accounts was immensely effective. Some estimate that over 400 million births were avoided. What this has created in China is another problem that's known as a number sequence, the 4-2-1 problem, where you have 4 grandparents for every 2 parents for every 1 child in China. After 40 years of this policy and other unanticipated effects that went on, it's made China's population pyramid look much less like a pyramid and more like a tree, where you have a big bolus of population working its way up through the top. Let me see. So in 2018, today, there are 155 million people in China that are age 65 or older. And the ratio of working adults to each retiree is currently about 5-to-1. That's a very important ratio because that represents the number of people who are creating the economic value to produce the tax revenues and even the direct aid to that senior population. Over the next 30 years, China's population is actually going to turn a corner and start to decrease. So it'll be about 50 million people less over that time than it is today. By 2050, the age 65 population or over in China will be 370 million people. And if you add the layer of the cake right below that, the 60 to 65 population, that number swells to almost 500 million. And the number, that ratio I just talked about working adults to retirees, plummets to about 1.5-to-1. And by 2060, and through the end of this century, China's population will eventually end up at about 1 billion people, much where it started in 1979 when the one-child policy was implemented. And that ratio I talked about of the working adults to retirees will go down to just slightly over 1.1-to-1, where it will remain pretty much until the end of the century. Let's see here. This aging population is going to be an expensive one to care for. They'll have all the typical diseases and chronic conditions associated with age and increasing affluence. Heart disease, hypertension, cancer, diabetes, obesity. The prevalence numbers are staggering, and this is a looming crisis that will play out in slow motion over the rest of this century. China will need increasing amounts of all cutting-edge medications and medical devices. And filling that need is going to be the crux of the problem. So is there a way to peer into the future through some crystal ball to see what lay ahead for China and what might be learned from it? And the answer is yes. Rudong County sits in rural China on the east coast of China, about 3 hours north of Shanghai. This is China's canary in the coal mine because in the 1960s, Rudong County began the one-child policy about 10 years before it was adopted for the country as a whole. So shortly after 2030, Rudong County is projected to have a population of age 60 or above of 60% of the people in that county. That's actually much higher of a number than the rest of China is ever expected to get. And why is that? The one-child policy, while it played an important role, was only part of the problem. The unanticipated parts were urbanization caused by education and job opportunities in the big cities, the increased expense of raising large families in an urban environment in a place like China, and also the decreasing marriage rates, and that also had a contribution to the decreasing birth rates that things like education, higher cost of families and jobs also brought with it. You see the same thing playing out essentially in the United States and in other countries all over Asia, but not to the degree that it does in China because of the population. All of this adds a whole new dimension, the urbanization, to the impact of this crisis on rural populations. It threatens to undermine traditions of filial piety that's important in Chinese culture, something that we're also already seeing unwind in Rudong County. And the rural nature of these is going to make the problem a little bit more difficult to treat, to diagnose, to monitor, and to cure these conditions. So we are on a countdown to 2050. How do we slant the playing field in favor of success? Well, in the real estate business, a common mantra for success is called location, location, location. You need three things. In our founder, Alfred Mann, his mantra for success in the medical device business, and it implies to pharma as well, was capital, capital, capital. And I'll add that it also takes time, time, time to get regulatory approvals, to do the research and development. We have one of our spin-outs that has been around for 6 years, and it finally is getting FDA approval this year. Took $150 million of raised capital beyond what we put into it before we launched the company. So where is all this capital going to come from? A lot of people and institutions are going to play a role, and one of them we want to begin with is the government. In 2015, President Xi announced the Made in China 2025 initiative. It's a monumental plan to put China in a leading position in 10 key technological and industrial areas by the year 2025. And one of them is medical technologies and medical devices. I'm not going to dwell a lot on this as a policy matter because there's a whole talk on this topic tomorrow morning in tomorrow morning's session, but I do want to talk about just a recent personal experience I had visiting China Medical City in connection with trying to find a home for one of our projects. It is a massive undertaking. They are trying to take 30 square kilometers of farmland and recreate and re-envision it into a healthcare city. It is the first and only national level high-tech science park exclusively devoted to the medicines and the life sciences. And this is what it's going to look like when it's finished. It's going to have hospitals, industrial, research and development, recreational, residential, unprecedented access to the China FDA, supply chain, manufacturing, research. And it's attracting both world-class companies and startups from China and the rest of the world. But that's not going to be enough. The rest is going to have to come from the private sector, and this is where the China venture community comes in as well. In the first quarter of 2017, the venture community invested about $125 million in healthcare ventures. The first quarter of this year, it was $1.4 billion, and it's really been ramped up, and that represents about 40% of the total of healthcare investments between the US and China combined. What are they investing in? They're investing in traditional pharma and medtech, of course, but also robotics, artificial intelligence, drone technology, and autonomous vehicles. All of these have healthcare implications. Robotics are already being used for companionship devices to avoid depression and loneliness in countries like Japan. The robotic surgery tools are developing to such a state where it can bring respected surgeons in urban centers out to rural areas to perform surgeries. Drone technologies can deliver samples back to the cities, deliver healthcare out to the rural areas as well. But in my view, there's still a missing piece, and this should not surprise you when you understand the organization that I represent. It's a nonprofit organization in Los Angeles. It shouldn't surprise you that based on the nature of that organization, I strongly believe that there is a critical role for nonprofits and charitable giving to support these efforts, not just as part of the healthcare delivery system in the way of hospitals and all, and not just as part of the healthcare safety net, like the Red Cross or some other disaster response agency, but also in the actual research, development, and bringing to market of these medical technologies. China currently lags other major international economies in charitable giving, only about 0.2% of GDP compared to the US, which is about tenfold higher. Now, the topic of why that's so and the charitable giving environment in China could be the subject of a whole separate talk, maybe even a whole separate conference, and that's not where I'm going to dwell today. What I want to conclude on is that all the building blocks are there. There are 250 billionaires in China today, more on the way. 100 of them live in Beijing, more than in New York City. China has a strong and growing middle class, currently at estimates range up to 150 million and projected to grow as high as 850 million by 2030, just a little bit around the corner. That's going to be more than the combined population of EU and the United States. And they have growing disposable income, very little debt, and a concern about healthcare issues for themselves and, again, their aging parents and grandparents. We know from our 35-year history at AMF that nonprofits applying resources that are given to them by wealthy entrepreneurs like our founder, Al Mann, or others, and also getting it from the public, this through direct donation, can fill an important part of that mold, because without investors, we can take bolder moves, bolder initiatives. In our history, we have taken on projects that the private sector won't take on. One of our first major projects was inventing cochlear implants that'll restore hearing for deaf people. We have sensors that will enable thought-controlled prosthetics for robotic prosthetic devices and hands. We have retinal prosthetics that will supply a kind of rudimentary digital sight to certain forms of blindness. Microstimulators that reanimate paralyzed limbs. By looking at opportunities through the dual lenses of our mission, which is to bring medical technology to unmet medical needs, and the markets, nonprofits can be the final piece in a puzzle to help solve this looming crisis in China. Thank you.